This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 340 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So at the end of Week 16, Fantasy Football Championship Week, we had a game between the Packers and the Vikings. In that game, Aaron Jones ended up breaking a huge touchdown run, and he finished the day with 154 yards on the ground and 2 scores. Jones won a lot of people a fantasy championship with that performance. And it was the perfect time to have that performance. It wasn't just during the most important week of the fantasy season, it was during an island game. It was the last game of the week. Anyone needing a big performance heading into Monday night was saved. The next day, someone pointed out to me on Twitter that I, JJ, was trashed on Reddit after the Aaron Jones performance. Because as any of you guys know, earlier in the season, I said to sell Aaron Jones. And then when Jones had that stretch of disappointing performances, I brought it back up on the show when explaining negativity bias. And this person on Reddit saw that as me victory lapping the Aaron Jones sell transaction. Now, I understand if it was taken that way. I'm only human and I'm a passionate human. I like putting energy and effort into the things that I love. And like any other human on this planet, I'm flawed. I don't always handle situations the way I should. I don't always say the right things. And most importantly, I don't always make the right decisions. And I definitely don't always give the right fantasy advice. I preach process over results on this show all the time. When it comes to anything in the predictions business, it's really important to have a process for decision making as long as that process has proven to work. You don't want a process just for the sake of having one. It still needs to be good, and it always needs to be refined. And that's why I do this show every year. Today, I'm going to let my worst calls of the year be known. I'm going to walk through the worst results of the fantasy football season. Because again, like every season, I got stuff wrong this year. But when talking about the results, the important thing I want to focus on is whether or not the process that led me to a certain decision made sense or not. I said to sell Aaron Jones, and that ended up being not the best advice in the world given the result. But would I do it again? Given the information that I had, would I still make that same recommendation? Those are the types of questions that I want to answer today. Some may see this as me defending my bad takes. But if I wanted to defend my bad takes, why would I do an entire episode of this podcast showcasing my bad takes? I'm literally telling you guys on this show how I effed up this year. And I'm doing this because it's important. It's really important to find cracks in your process in order to win over the long run. Now, before getting into some of those bad results this year, I want to remind you guys about FanDuel's 2020 bonus. To celebrate the start of 2020, FanDuel's offering a 2020 bonus in every January featured NBA shot contest. Just roster a player who records a 2020 game and win a share of $20,000. For more details, visit FanDuel.com/NBA or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Let's kick things off with Aaron Jones since I talked about him at the start. The logic for selling Jones earlier this season is pretty much the baseline logic and process that I use for most running backs. I ask, is this player scoring touchdowns at a higher rate than he should be scoring touchdowns? And then I also ask, is this player a true bell cow type back? For Jones, he was absolutely scoring touchdowns at a higher rate than he should have been. And then Jamal Williams was involved in that backfield. Williams was banged up at times throughout the season. He essentially missed 3 games because he was knocked out in that one against Philadelphia early on. Aaron Jones' top 3 snap shares of the season came in the 3 games without Jamal Williams. Snaps correlate to fantasy points really well. So if a healthy Jamal Williams was in the lineup, then Aaron Jones wouldn't be seeing as many snaps. When you look at Jones' season in sum and you include the games without Jamal Williams, Jones ranked 14th in the NFL in running back rush share. That's fine, but it's definitely not elite. What helped him out was that he was also 9th in target share. So he was seeing a pretty strong market share overall in that backfield. The take in selling Jones wasn't that he was some scrub who didn't deserve to be started in fantasy football. It was that he was outperforming where he should have been performing. He was a top running back when I saw him more as a lower end RB1. But I do think I slightly overstated the impact that Jamal Williams was having on Jones's general market share. There should have been more of a comparison to other running backs, since the majority of running backs in the NFL are in some sort of timeshare anyway. It's not that I didn't recognize this. It's just that I should have put more weight into the idea of, okay, what running backs are actually going to give you more of an edge than Aaron Jones? That, I think, was the biggest mistake. His volume, without factoring touchdowns, should have probably yielded mid-range RB1 results. I had him more as a lower-end RB1. And then he finished as a higher-end RB1 because of the biggest piece of this fantasy season, which was his touchdowns. If you listen to this show throughout the season, you know that I often reference yards to touchdowns to spot touchdown regression. Essentially, yards correlate strongly to touchdowns, so if a player has a ton of yards and very few touchdowns, we'd expect things to regress to the mean a bit moving forward. In Jones's case, he had way more touchdowns than a typical running back would given his yardage total. That was consistent throughout the entire season. And the way things ended really sheds light to this. It really shows us how big of an outlier season Aaron Jones had. He finished the year with under 1,100 yards rushing, and he finished with 16 rushing touchdowns. In NFL history, that's only happened one other time, and it hasn't happened since 1975. According to the yards to touchdown conversion, which looks at how running backs have scored versus their yardage total since 2011, Jones outperformed his touchdown total by 9.5 this year. That was the fourth highest number that we've seen over the last 9 years. It was behind LeGarrette Blount's 2016, Todd Gurley's 2018, and LaShawn McCoy's 2011. And that type of overachieving was seen in touchdown regression models as well, like Mike Clay's opportunity-adjusted touchdown metric. Two things that I do want to point out with this yards to touchdown thing is that context is obviously needed, but also running backs, at least compared to wide receivers, they're going to have an easier time beating it. The context thing is obvious. Better teams will be more efficient scoring touchdowns, so players on good teams will have higher touchdown totals. But the part about running backs beating it simply means that there's a larger spread between players who overperform and the players who really underperform. Likely because running backs get a lot of short yardage touchdowns. Now, with all that being said, we did see some inconsistent production from Jones this year that comes when you're not seeing a full bell cow workload. In November, there was a stretch where Jones had horrible performances in 3 of 4 games, and Jamal Williams was basically outperforming him. Jones had a really inconsistent season for being a top 5 running back in fantasy. The glimpses that we saw was basically what I was worried about. The difference is that his highs were higher than I expected, and I didn't give his overall volume enough context. That's something that I have to work on when communicating buy and sell candidates moving forward. And for the record, it's honestly bizarre that people have used Aaron Jones against me this season. Like, I get why they are, but of all players, it's wild. For those of you who were with the show during its early episodes, and first off, thank you. But second, you know that I was and I am an Aaron Jones truther. He's awesome. He's my highest rostered dynasty asset. So I hope it's very clear that my take with him this season has everything to do with math and nothing to do with the player. The second biggest results-related mistake that I made this year was with Derrick Henry. And the Derrick Henry stuff is way worse than Aaron Jones. Because during draft season, I was very cool with you getting Aaron Jones. I had him on redraft teams too. But Derrick Henry was someone who I thought was a player to avoid. That ended up easily being the worst call of my entire fantasy football season. And it looks even worse after what he's been doing after the fantasy season's been over. Honestly, I really lucked out that Derrick Henry had a bad Week 15 performance, and then he didn't play in Week 16. So he didn't really help teams in the fantasy football playoffs. But it was still a bad call on my end. So let's walk through to see if the process was flawed. Derrick Henry before Ryan Tannehill was a completely different fantasy running back than Derrick Henry after Ryan Tannehill. During the first 6 weeks of the season, Henry averaged a nice 69 yards and 14.6 PPR points per game. When Tannehill took over, his yards per game rose to 125, and his PPR points per game to almost 23. What I think I got wrong with Derrick Henry when I called him a sell candidate around the time that Ryan Tannehill took over was that I didn't see that coming. And to be honest, I didn't even allow that to be a thought in my head. I didn't think Ryan Tannehill being the most efficient passer in football was even possible. And that was ignorant of me. I actually don't think the process of avoiding him at the beginning of the season was all that wrong. If you look at his games with Marcus Mariota, he wasn't very good for fantasy purposes, despite scoring touchdowns at a higher than normal rate. And the main reason why is because Tennessee wasn't benefiting from positive or even neutral game scripts. Through Week 6, which is the split with Marcus Mariota, Tennessee was 12th in the NFL in offensive plays run while trailing by 7 or more points. Once Tannehill took over, they ran the 10th fewest offensive plays while trailing by a touchdown. For a player like Derrick Henry, whose concern entering the year was, what's going to happen when the Titans are in a negative game script, that concern almost vanished. Tennessee really only had one bad loss once Ryan Tannehill took over. And it just so happened to come against the Panthers, who were the worst team at defending running backs this year. Henry's snap rates reflect this as well. From weeks 1 through 6, he played an average of 57.6% of the team's snaps. That jumped by over 10% with Ryan Tannehill under center. So think about what that means. You get a running back who is bound to see a lot of volume on the ground. In fact, to all of you who think that I'm some Derrick Henry hater, I actually called him out on FanDuel's Covering the Spread podcast before the season started as the best bet to win the rushing title. So eat it, haters. But in all seriousness, we knew that he'd get a lot of volume on the ground. When you combine that with the positive game scripts that hit when Ryan Tannehill took over, and when you know that Henry's a monster and he's going to see goal line work, that's how you get a season like he just had. So like I said, I think my biggest flaw with Derrick Henry this year was assuming that Ryan Tannehill would be just as good, or bad, I guess, as Marcus Mariota. That's a big learning for me moving forward. That when such an important position changes for a team, we shouldn't just assume the worst. We shouldn't assume that things stay the same. Because especially in Tennessee's case, it was hard for that offense to be that much worse. And it just so happened that everything really came together. That Tannehill wasn't just better than Mariota, but he was probably the most efficient passer in football this year. If I had known that would happen, there's no chance in hell that I would have sold Derrick Henry. But I got that wrong and I paid the price. I thought Russell Wilson was overvalued entering the season. You guys might remember my chicken sandwich analogy that I made before the season when referencing Wilson with Brian Schottenheimer. I was not into Russell Wilson. I guess you could call that a miss. And the reason I'm saying I guess is because he really wasn't nearly as good as his final season rank shows. He was 5th in points per game, and he was actually 4th if you remove Matthew Stafford. But he really helped his average by having some blow-up performances. He had 2 of the top 5 best fantasy performances by a quarterback this year. The fear with Wilson from my perspective heading into the season was passing touchdown regression and overall volume. Volume doesn't correlate that well to fantasy success at quarterback, but you have to care about it at the extremes. And after what we saw with Schottenheimer's offense in year 1 with Seattle, it was hard to feel super optimistic about year 2. They were bound to throw more than they did in 2018, but the question was, how much more? I did say at the beginning of the season that I couldn't fault anyone for drafting Wilson if they thought the pass attempt numbers were going to rise pretty dramatically. I just didn't project him to hit 500 attempts, and he had 516, so I was a little bit off. But the touchdown rate did indeed regress. Wilson's one of those players who will always have an above average touchdown rate. But in 2018, it was almost on the same level as Patrick Mahomes' touchdown rate. And as we know, Mahomes had a historic, unrepeatable season. Wilson's dropped by 2.2% this past year. And that was expected. But he did see a little bit more work on the ground, and he regressed positively there with 3 rushing touchdowns. But I do think the process was generally right for Russell Wilson. I probably should have taken advice from the haters out there who trashed me for not loving Wilson this year, because Russell Wilson really is a special player. And that translates. But he averaged just 17 fantasy points per game from week 7 on. And that was with a 39-point performance. But my lesson here is that I probably won't fade historically good quarterbacks when their ADPs don't really matter that much. Wilson was QB 10 entering the year, and I should have just let that be. I think I had him at QB 12 after things settled with Andrew Luck. Basically what I'm getting at is that it really wasn't a worthwhile battle. Though I do think the touchdown regression process was right. Some of you may not even remember this, but I liked Sammy Watkins entering the year. Sammy Watkins is now dead to me. But there were some interesting splits with Watkins in 2018. When he played 75% or more of Kansas City snaps in 8 regular season games and 2 playoff games, he averaged almost 14 PPR points per game and just 0.4 fewer targets per game than Tyreek Hill. After week 1, I was obviously feeling pretty good. But then Sammy Watkins was just wildly ineffective. It's hard to say whether the process was right or not with Watkins. I'm leaning towards yes, that it was right. And that it was fine. Watkins was being drafted after the 5th round, which is where things tend to become a lot more volatile and unimportant. And when you break down his season, he missed 2 games and had a 16% target share. So that target share likely would have been closer to 18% had he been healthy all year. If you were handed a player who was going to see over 100 targets and an 18% target share in a Patrick Mahomes-led offense, you'd probably take that player. In the end, we're really trying to project volume. But he was just insanely inefficient, like I said. He ended up underperforming in the touchdown column based on his yardage total by the biggest number in his entire career. He averaged the fewest yards per target of his career. And he ended up with just 6 red zone targets in 14 games when he had 10 of them last year in 10 games. Sammy Watkins just sucked this year. And it's crazy because he looked really good in week 1. So it was a result that I got 100% wrong. But it was a process that I would repeat over and over again. I'll always buy relatively cheap volume in what's projected to be one of the best passing offenses in football. I faded early round tight ends this year. That's something that I'm going to talk about on next week's show. But I did continuously talk in the preseason about how middle round tight ends seemed a little bit different in 2019, where historically those were terrible bets. And I recognized that. But in 2019, instead of those tight ends being players like Greg Olsen, who was giving you a floor and not a ceiling, you had young ceiling players like Evan Ingram, Hunter Henry, and OJ Howard. Ingram was pretty good when he was healthy, and Henry had decent weeks throughout the season as well. But I liked OJ Howard the most out of that group. And that, like everything else on today's show, was wrong. The rationale behind drafting OJ Howard was that the Buccaneers' target distribution was bound to be pretty narrow, given there weren't many weapons outside of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. So there was definitely opportunity for OJ Howard to step up. And then on top of that, there was the chance that Howard might have just been special. What he did per target and per catch during his first 2 seasons were basically only matched by Rob Gronkowski and Vernon Davis. And those guys didn't even do it during their first 2 seasons. Howard was insanely efficient. And even with a little regression, given he was expected to see a spike in volume, he had a chance to go absolutely nuts. The point about Bruce Arians' offense was brought up multiple times on this show before the season started. How Arians really had never used tight ends very heavily in his offenses. And I mostly dismissed it. The main reason is because the majority of the time when we analyze fantasy that way, we put way too much weight into the wrong thing. And by that way, I'm referring to coordinator data. Now, I look at coordinator data a lot, and it's an important way to analyze for purposes of projections. But positional information has a lot of noise to it, since skill set is going to change from one team to the next. For example, for a while, there was a narrative that Kyle Shanahan loved to feed his ex-receivers. But he also had Julio Jones and Andre Johnson. Now, Pierre Garçon had a crazy year under Shanahan, but there wasn't much competition. Now, we've seen that shift as his personnel has changed, but overdrafting players because of these positional narratives is a very real thing. There are times where the positional narrative ends up being pretty real, though, and that was the case for OJ Howard. Howard saw his average depth of target drop by almost 2 yards year over year, and despite having so few options to throw to, Tampa Bay tight ends still saw fewer than 20% of the team's targets. They were completely average at targeting the tight end, though they didn't have that much at pass catcher. So Howard never saw that volume spike, and his efficiency did regress. It was a perfect storm for him to not produce. Drafting tight ends late continues to be the way to go. I bought into Dante Pettis over the offseason, and this is one of the results-related mistakes that I'm actually mad at myself for, where I went away from the process and I was just really stupid. That's going to happen every once in a while. There was somewhat of an opening for volume in that San Francisco offense this year. My projections had Pettis at like wide receiver 30 to 35 as I first built my projections, but there was some room for growth there if he became something bigger for that team. So to me, there looked like there was going to be some floor for Pettis, but then the ceiling was, oh man, what if Dante Pettis is actually good? And that was my idiotic downfall. Seriously, guys, I'm mad that I did this. It was so against my process that I'm literally tilting over it. Dante Pettis was never someone that I was really into as a prospect. You can go back and listen to old draft shows before his rookie season. I had no feelings towards Dante Pettis. He just kind of existed. Over the last 2 years, if you look at who my prospect model has liked at wide receiver, you've got DJ Moore by far at number 1. Moore's one of my model's favorite wide receivers ever. And then there's N'Keal Harry, A.J. Brown, Andy Isabella, Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, James Washington, and Marquise Brown. Next is Deebo Samuel. 6 spots after Deebo Samuel is Dante Pettis. Now, I didn't mind Deebo Samuel at all from a redraft perspective this year. And one of my bold predictions on the season was that he was going to be the highest scoring rookie wide receiver. The main problem with my projecting of this offense is that I really should have allowed myself to be okay with a rookie wide receiver outperforming a second-year guy, especially when I actually liked that rookie receiver more as a prospect. Pettis underperformed where I thought he'd be, don't get me wrong. The flaw that I made with my process isn't a flaw where I should have actually projected Pettis to be bad. I just shouldn't have assumed the upside portion. I basically should have shifted his range of outcomes downward. I'm going to really need to be more strict with how I deal with wide receiver prospects moving forward in redraft, I think. Another situation where I didn't think enough outside the box this year was with Kenyon Drake. When the trade went down and Drake went to Arizona, I made him a sell candidate. It was hard for me to envision a scenario where he'd take over that backfield, or at the very least, see a ton of receiving work to really become an ultra-relevant fantasy asset. When the trade went down, I believe I called Drake more of a high-end RB3, and then David Johnson becomes more of an RB2 based on volume. Running backs generate volume more than wide receivers and tight end via coaching decisions. A wide receiver and tight end needs to get open in order to see a target. Of course, scheme can help with this, but I'm generalizing here to help drive home this point. With a running back, he just needs to see the field. If a running back is consistently on the field, and if that running back is in a good offense, then he's going to be a good fantasy asset. Sometimes you get a running back who's always on the field in a bad situation, like with Leonard Fournette, but then the opposite happens too, like we saw with San Francisco this year. The 49ers scored the most fantasy points per game by a team, but they didn't have a reliable piece the entire season at running back because they rotated their backs. Now, the reason I bring this up is because talent matters less at that position as a result. I don't want to dive into a running back value debate because that's not necessary for today's show. But the reason we should be looking at running back talent is because of this very example with Kenyon Drake. If a player is better, even if that player is playing a replaceable position, we should care. Because if he's the better player, rational coaching tells us that that player is going to see the field more. And that's exactly what happened with Kenyon Drake. Props to the Cardinals for being rational. My mistake wasn't so much that I never believed in Drake. It was that I didn't believe in the Arizona coaching staff to make David Johnson, who was really making a living off of volume to start the year. But I didn't believe that they'd make him irrelevant. But they did. And I missed as a result. Fortunately, I did realize my mistake pretty soon after and I tried to fix it, but overall, I read that situation wrong initially. That's why Kenyon Drake is on today's list. Now, the last player I want to talk about today is Mark Ingram. I'd say with Ingram, Derrick Henry, and Aaron Jones, the story was pretty similar in a lot of ways. But Ingram is probably more like Aaron Jones than he is Derrick Henry. I wasn't very high on Ingram entering the season, which is kind of weird when you think about how high I was on Lamar Jackson. So that was my first mistake. But I projected there to be a split backfield, and I didn't see a ton of receiving work going Ingram's way. Those were two key reasons that I didn't like him. And I don't think that was totally wrong. Ingram was 21st in running back rush share this year, and even when you look at all running backs on a per game basis, it wasn't any better. He ended the year with a 7% target share, which is fine, but it's not so fine for the run heaviest team in football. I'll get more into this next week when I talk about my biggest hits, but even though I liked Lamar Jackson, I can't sit here and pretend that I expected the Ravens offense to do this in 2019. Only 6 teams have scored more touchdowns than the 2019 Ravens since 2011. I thought Lamar Jackson would ball out, but not to this level. That helped Ingram tremendously. He ended up finding the end zone 15 times, which was almost 7 more than what his yardage total dictated. Of course, this has to do with the offense that he's playing in, but expecting that next season would be pretty foolish. But that's why he's a little like Aaron Jones for me this year. I was a lot higher on Jones entering the season, but if we look at the logic behind selling these players, it was pretty similar. They weren't full-blown bell cows, and they were overperforming in the touchdown column, even when you factor in situation. I mean, Mark Ingram had 5 receiving touchdowns on 30 targets this year, you guys. Since 2011, only 2 running backs have seen 5 or more touchdowns on 40 or fewer targets. And Ingram's just the second running back in NFL history to have 5 or more touchdowns on 30 or fewer targets. And actually, the other player who did it, Mike Sellers, was a hybrid player. He wasn't even a traditional running back. Basically, what I'm saying is, I do think this was an outlier season for Mark Ingram. Things really did go his way. And it's very likely that I'm going to miss on a player like him in the future, just given my process. Now, you might have listened to today's show and you thought to yourself, JJ, you just really seem to miss out on running backs who score a lot of touchdowns. So let's talk about that for a second. Really, 2019 was just pretty odd for those 3 running backs in particular. Of all running back seasons since 2011, 4 of the top 11 seasons in overachieving in the touchdown column based on the yardage to touchdown conversion that I work with, 4 of the 11 occurred in 2019. Todd Gurley is the 4th one along with Henry, Jones, and Ingram. So maybe now you're saying, JJ, maybe yards to touchdowns is a bad way to just spot regression. Well, I can tell you that touchdowns do regress this way, but looking at it year over year can help show this in a more direct way. If you look at the top 25 overachieving running back seasons in yards to touchdowns since 2011 that also have next season data, so we're removing the guys who overachieved this year. But if you look at the top 25 seasons in terms of this guy should have had fewer touchdowns, all but one of those players scored fewer touchdowns the following year. And that one player was Adrian Peterson in 2011 to 2012, who scored the exact same number. And since some of that just has to do with staying healthy, all but two of them saw their touchdowns per game drop. When looking at the other side of things, all but four players increased their per game touchdown rates the following year. I've seen critiques of this very simple technique. People have hit me up on Twitter. They've talked about it on Reddit. It's not perfect, and I don't sell it as perfect. It's always been a very quick and easy way for everyone to be able to check and see if a player is looking like he's going to regress in the touchdown column. But some of the critiques that I see are that it won't spot regression properly in season, that it only helps year over year. And to push back on that, there's generally a bias that comes with that type of response. Yes, it likely won't be as extreme in season as it will year over year, because year over year, a lot of things change to team personnel. But for every Aaron Jones, there are dozens of players who do regress. We just don't pay attention to those players because regression is essentially the expectation. But I've learned lessons this year. I've learned to not overstate that regression in season, and that I need to be better at communicating where these running backs stand versus the rest of their position. I can guarantee you that the 15 Transactions show next year are going to give you more context around these guys. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. There won't be a mailbag show this week because I'll be traveling for a conference, but I'll be back in your ears next week with a show going over the things that I got right. I'll talk to you then.